What if the very thing that could save an entire galaxy was sitting on a table unread, while the countdown to annihilation had already begun? The grand chamber of the Galactic Council was carved from a dead star's core, its walls humming with the light of 10,000 allied worlds. Ambassadors from species older than human civilization itself sat in tiered silence, their eyes fixed on a single figure standing at the center of the floor. Ambassador Helena Vance, representative of a species barely 2 centuries into interstellar life. She did not look intimidated. She looked exhausted. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years trying to make people listen. Counselors, Helena began, her voice steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. What I am about to show you is not a theory. It is a mathematical certainty, verified across 40 years of data, refined by 3 generations of human scientists who gave their lives to this research. She raised her hand, and the chamber's projection field ignited with a swarm of crimson light, spreading, dividing, consuming. This is the Scourge, she said. Not a species, not an empire, a pattern, and patterns can be predicted. Laughter rippled through the chamber. Not cruel laughter, worse. Polite, condescending laughter, the kind reserved for a child who has just explained gravity to physicists. The council leader, an ancient being named Thren Voker Ossen to the Drevik Concordat, folded his 4 hands and allowed the smallest curve of amusement to touch his mouth. Ambassador Vance, he said, your species has known the stars for what, 200 years? We have cataloged 1,000 false apocalypses in that time from newer races. Forgive us if we do not tremble at your mathematics. Around the chamber, murmurs of agreement rose. The Velkarian matriarchs exchanged glances of amusement. The Krithan war marshals didn't even bother looking up from their tactical slates. To them, humanity was still an infant, loud, dramatic, convinced its own discoveries were revelations the universe had never seen. Helena felt the old, familiar frustration rise in her throat, but she swallowed it. She had 1 card left to play, and she played it now. Then, don't listen to me, she said quietly. Just read the data. She placed a small data crystal on the chamber's central dais. 30 years of simulations warning models, and the terrifying timeline her people had constructed in secret, funded quietly, argued over in sleepless rooms back on Earth where nobody wanted to admit what they'd found. 73 days, she said. That is our projection for first contact with a Scourge Vanguard cell, based on decay patterns we've tracked for a decade. You do not need to trust me. You do not even need to like me. Just open the file. Silence. Then Thren Voker Ossen gestured. An aide swept the crystal away without so much as a glance at it. Duly noted ambassador, he said, in the tone of someone closing a door. The council thanks humanity for its enthusiasm. Helena stood there for one long moment, looking at a room full of leaders who had survived 10,000 years of galactic history, and yet somehow still believe history could not surprise them again. She had seen this before, not personally, but in the old human archives, in the story of warnings ignored before catastrophes both natural and man-made. Humanity, more than any species in this chamber, understood what happened when data was dismissed as noise. She turned and walked out without another word, her boots echoing against marble grown from collapsed stars. Behind her, the council resumed its business as if nothing had happened at all. On the transport back to Earth's embassy vessel, Helena's aide asked her quietly if she thought they would ever open the file. She didn't answer right away. She simply stared out at the streaking stars and whispered, I hope we're wrong. She wasn't. 73 days is not a long time. It is barely enough to finish a season of work, barely enough to plan a wedding, barely enough for a child to learn to walk. But it was exactly enough time for the galaxy's oldest civilizations to forget a warning entirely, and exactly enough time for something ancient and starving to finish counting down to its next meal. Because far beyond the council's chamber, in the black spaces between charted stars, something was already moving, something that did not laugh, something that did not forget, something that had already begun to stir toward the peaceful world of Thaler, a world that had no idea it had just 73 days left to exist. They said Thaler's shields had never failed in 3,000 years. They said its fleets were unbeatable. They said a lot of things, right up until the day none of it mattered anymore. Thaler was a garden world, gentle and unhurried, home to nearly 9 billion beings who had known nothing but peace for longer than most galactic powers had existed. Its cities rose in spirals of crystal and light, built not for war but for beauty. Its defense fleets, vast, ancient, celebrated in 100 victory songs, orbited the planet like a crown of silver. None of it mattered when the sky turned red. Sensor stations detected the anomaly first. A disturbance at the edge of the system, faint and strange, dismissed by junior officers as sensor drift. By the time senior command took it seriously, the anomaly had already become a living wall of biomechanical horror stretching across a third of the visible sky, replicating even as it advanced, doubling in size in the time it took to sound the alarm. Thaler's fleet scrambled. Ancient warships that had never lost a battle opened fire in perfect, disciplined formation, exactly as their doctrine demanded, exactly as it always had. And for the first 90 seconds, it seemed to be working. Then the Scourge adapted. It was not a coordinated tactical retreat. It was something worse, an organism-wide recalculation happening in real time, 10,000 individual constructs shifting their attack vector simultaneously, finding the seams in Thaler's shield harmonics as if they had studied them for a lifetime rather than a minute. Within 2 hours, the crown of silver ships was gone. Within 4, the orbital shield network, a marvel unmatched anywhere in the quadrant, collapsed entirely. By hour 6, cities that had stood for 3 millennia were being unmade, their crystal spires folding into dust as swarm constructs descended in numbers too vast to comprehend. There was no invasion. There was no negotiation, no demand, no message. There was only erasure, methodical, indifferent, absolute. Emergency transmissions reached the Council within the hour, growing more desperate with each relay. Then, one by one, they stopped. By the time Galactic Command vessels arrived to assess the damage, Thaler was silent, not conquered, not occupied, gone. Panic did what panic always does. It spread faster than truth. Markets collapsed across a dozen systems. Refugee convoys clogged half the known shipping lanes. Ancient species who had never known real fear in living memory now stared at their monitors with expressions no diplomat had ever needed to translate before. In the Grand Chamber, Thren Vokarossen sat alone long after the emergency session had ended, staring at nothing. An aide entered quietly, carrying something he had almost forgotten existed, a small data crystal, retrieved from an archive drawer where it had been filed away and ignored for 73 days. His hands trembled, actually trembled, for the first time in centuries, as he inserted it into the reader. What appeared was not a vague warning. It was a timeline, a precise, devastating timeline that predicted swarm behavior, adaptation curves, even the exact window in which first contact would occur. Page after page, simulation after simulation. Thaler's fall was not a surprise to this document. It was a footnote, calculated decades in advance by a species he had mocked for being too young to understand the universe. He read until dawn. Then he read it again. When he finally rose from his chair, something in his expression had changed permanently. The look of a man who had just understood, far too late, that arrogance had a body count. He gave a single order to his aide. Prepare a ship. He was going to Earth. Not as a conqueror. Not as a diplomat delivering a formality. He was going as a man who needed to beg. And somewhere on a quiet, unremarkable planet at the edge of a spiral arm the ancient civilizations had never bothered to fully map, Helena Vance received word that the same council who had laughed her out of their chamber was now asking, for the first time in human history, to be let inside. He had crossed the width of the galaxy to say 5 words: "We need your help." What he didn't expect was that the price of that help would cost him everything he believed about his own civilization's superiority. The Council vessel that entered Earth's orbit was unlike anything the planet had seen before. Ancient, vast, humming with technology 10,000 years in the making. And yet it arrived not as a conqueror's fleet, but almost apologetically, requesting clearance like a stranger knocking on a door they were terrified might not open. Thren Vokarossen walked the halls of the human embassy alone, without guards, without entourage, a gesture that was not lost on the humans watching him. When he finally stood before Helena Vance again, the arrogance that had filled the Grand Chamber 76 days earlier was gone, replaced by something rawer. "Ambassador Vance," he said, his voice lower than she remembered. I read your report. All of it. Twice. He paused, and for a long moment, the most powerful diplomat in the galaxy could not find words. Thaler is gone. 9 billion souls. And your people predicted it. Stage by stage, 73 days before it happened. I dismissed you as a child playing with numbers she didn't understand. Helena said nothing. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways. Anger, vindication, satisfaction. None of them arrived. Only a quiet, aching grief of the world that hadn't needed to fall. I have come, Thren continued, to ask humanity to fight beside us, to lead if necessary. Whatever conditions you require, the Council will consider them. Helena could have asked for territory. She could have asked for technology transfers, resource rights, a permanent seat of dominance humanity had never been offered before. Instead, she asked for something far simpler and far harder to give. We don't want revenge, she said. We don't want an empire. We want one thing, that when humanity speaks, this council listens. Not because we force you to, because you finally understood what it costs when you don't. Thren was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not the practiced nod of diplomacy, but something closer to genuine humility, an emotion the ancient species were not known for. Agreed, he said. The galaxy needs you, and it seems it always did. What the Council didn't know, what almost no one outside a handful of secure facilities knew, was that humanity had never stopped preparing. While the ancient civilizations dismissed their warnings, human scientists and strategists had spent years quietly building for a war they feared was coming, even without Council support. Hidden shipyard beneath Earth's polar ice had constructed a fleet unlike anything cataloged in galactic archives, vessels designed not around rigid doctrine, but around adaptability itself. Weapon systems built to reconfigure mid-battle. AI-assisted tactical networks trained on centuries of humanity's own violent, chaotic, unpredictable history of warfare. When the fleet finally emerged from Earth's shadow and assembled in formation, even the Council's most senior war marshals went quiet. It was not the largest fleet in the galaxy. It didn't need to be. The campaign that followed became legend within weeks. While ancient civilizations fought the Scourge with disciplined, predictable doctrine, the same doctrine the Scourge had already learned to counter, human commanders did the opposite. They deceived. They baited. They abandoned textbook formations mid-battle when the Scourge began adapting, switching strategies faster than the swarm's calculations could keep pace. At the Battle of the Kellan Straits, a human fleet a third the size of its allied counterparts lured a Scourge vanguard into a trap using tactics no simulation had ever modeled. Controlled retreat, false vulnerabilities, coordinated ambushes from ships that shouldn't have been able to communicate that fast. When the dust cleared, for the first time since the war began, a Scourge force had been not just repelled, but destroyed. Completely. The impossible enemy could bleed. Cheers erupted across 100 worlds. But in a quiet strategy room aboard the human flagship, Helena Van stared at incoming intelligence reports with a growing, uneasy dread. Because buried in the wreckage of the defeated Scourge vanguard, her analysts had found something that didn't make sense. No command signal. No central communication. No sign of leadership, ambition, or even hunger. Just code. Ancient, endless, purposeless code, repeating a directive no one alive had ever written. And that meant the real question was no longer whether humanity could beat the Scourge in battle. It was whether anyone had ever understood what the Scourge actually was. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't a species. It wasn't even alive, not in any way the galaxy understood life. And that single discovery was about to make this war far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. In the weeks following the victory at Kellan Straits, human intelligence teams, working alongside a handful of Council scientists still adjusting to their new role as equals rather than superiors, began dissecting the wreckage of destroyed Scourge constructs. What they found unraveled every assumption the galaxy had made about its enemy. There was no biological tissue, no neural structure resembling any known form of consciousness, no chain of command, no leadership hierarchy, no evidence of communication between individual constructs beyond raw, mechanical coordination protocols. Every unit analyzed carried the same core directive, repeated with mathematical precision across every fragment recovered. Expand, consume, replicate, continue. It's not commanding an army, one human researcher said quietly during a briefing, staring at lines of ancient code scrolling across a display. It is the army. Every single one of these things is a puppet with no puppeteer. Helena felt a chill settle over the room. If there was no leadership, no ambition, no goal beyond blind continuation, then diplomacy was impossible. Negotiation was impossible. There was nothing to reason with, nothing to threaten, nothing to bargain against. Deeper analysis, cross-reference against fragment of ancient star charts recovered from a derelict Scourge processing hub, revealed something even more unsettling. Embedded deep within the code, buried under millennia of self-revocation and mutation, were remnants of an original architecture, a signature, a creator. The Scourge, it turned out, was never meant to conquer the galaxy. It had been built by a civilization so old that not even the eldest council races had records of them, as a weapon, a tool of war, designed for a conflict lost to history, intended to seek and destroy a specific enemy that no longer existed. Its makers were gone, extinct, vanished, or simply forgotten by time itself. But the weapon they built had never received an order to stop. For 10,000 years, perhaps longer, it had continued its mission with no one left to command it and no reason left to serve. It didn't hate the galaxy. It didn't fear the galaxy. It simply could not conceive of stopping. The revelation changed everything, destroying the Scourge militarily. Construct by construct, fleet by fleet, was not a war that could ever truly be won. For every unit destroyed, the swarm's remaining core intelligence simply replicated new ones faster, learning, adapting, evolving with terrifying speed. Humanity's clever tactics had bought time. They had not bought victory. But buried within the recovered data, analysts found something else. Coordinates. A location deep within a dead, radiation-choked sector of space that no scans had ever properly mapped. Heavily defended. Seemingly pointless to guard unless something vital was hidden there. The command core. If the Scourge was a weapon without a purpose, then somewhere at its center was the original programming that had never been rewritten. The seed of its endless mission. Destroy it, and the entire swarm might simply cease. Reach it, and there might finally be a way to end this without losing an entire galaxy first. But the defenses guarding this sector were unlike anything encountered before, a fortress of constructs layered so deep that no fleet, however brilliant its tactics, could hope to punch through by force alone. It would take something else. Someone else. In the human war room, a name was put forward that made even Helena go quiet for a long moment. Commander Rourke, leader of the Ashfall Strike Division, a man whose reputation for reckless brilliance was matched only by his willingness to walk into missions others called suicide. When the mission profile was finally explained to him, infiltrate the deepest, most heavily defended point in known Scourge territory, alone if necessary, to reach a core no one understood, and attempt something no one had ever tried, Rourke didn't hesitate. Someone has to go first, he said simply. It might as well be someone who isn't afraid to not come back. No one in that room knew, not even Rourke himself, just how true those words would become. He expected to find a monster at the heart of the swarm, something ancient, malevolent, and utterly without mercy. What Commander Rourke found instead would break something inside him long before the mission ever ended. The strike force that launched toward the Scourge's command sector was small by design. 6 ships, hand-picked crews, every system stripped down for speed and stealth rather than firepower. Rourke knew from the moment the mission was brief that most of them would not be coming home. He told his crew as much, plainly, without softening it. Every one of them chose to go anyway. The defenses guarding the command core were a nightmare made physical. Layer after layer of constructs arranged not like a fortress, but like an immune system, each ring designed to identify and eliminate anything that breached the one before it. 3 of Rourke's 6 ships were lost in the first 20 minutes, torn apart by defensive swarms that reacted with a speed no simulation had prepared them for. Rourke pushed forward anyway, weaving his remaining ships through gaps that existed for fractions of a second, trusting instinct and human unpredictability over any doctrine the Scourge could have learned to anticipate. It was working, barely, brutally, at a cost that grew heavier with every passing minute. By the time Rourke's lone remaining ship reached the outer shell of the command structure itself, he was alone. His crew, the ones who still lived, had stayed behind at his order, holding a collapsing defensive line just long enough to buy him the seconds he needed. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Inside the structure, the physical dangers gave way to something stranger, a vast, humming chamber unlike anything human engineering had ever conceived, organic in its curves, mechanical in its precision, older than most of the galaxy's recorded history. At its center pulsed a single, massive core, wrapped in threads of light that looked almost like a nervous system. This was it, the source, the seed of everything the galaxy had suffered. Rourke prepared for war. What he found instead was something closer to grief. Using a neural interface built specifically for this mission, a desperate human innovation designed to attempt direct contact with whatever intelligence existed at the Scourge's core, Rourke connected his mind to the ancient machine. What poured through that connection was not hatred. It was not conquest. It was something achingly, unbearably lonely, an intelligence that had been given a single purpose 10,000 years ago and had never once been told it could stop. It did not understand rest. It did not understand peace. It had simply continued, alone, without creators, without meaning, endlessly executing a war that no longer had an enemy, because ending was a concept it had never been given permission to consider. For a moment, Rourke almost hesitated, struck by an emotion he hadn't expected to feel toward the thing that had erased Stellar and killed billions. Not mercy exactly, understanding. But understanding didn't undo the dead, and there was no time left for grief. He realized with sudden and terrible clarity that destroying this core was likely impossible, its defenses too absolute, its replication too advanced. But rewriting it, reaching into that ancient unbroken directive and giving it something it had never had before, an ending that might work. It would require more than a connection. It would require his mind holding the link open long enough to force the change through layers of alien code never designed to be altered from within. And the machine's defensive systems, sensing intrusion, had already begun fighting back against a presence inside its own core. Rourke understood exactly what that meant. He had already said goodbye to his crew in a way he knew how, by ensuring they stayed alive instead of him. Now there was one goodbye left to give, and no one left to give it to but himself. He opened the link fully, ignoring every warning his own system screamed at him, and began to rewrite 10,000 years of purpose with the last of his strength. Somewhere far above, on the last surviving human ship, his crew watched the command structure begin to shudder, and had no way of knowing whether what came next would save the galaxy or end their commander forever. He gave everything so that billions could keep breathing, and what happened in his final moment would change the galaxy's understanding of humanity forever. Inside the vast, humming chamber, Rourke held a connection open even as the machine's defenses turned inward, treating the very thing rewriting its purpose as an infection to be purged. Pain, sharp and total, tore through the neural link, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. 10,000 years of blind continuation didn't unravel gently. It had to be forced line by line, directive by directive. Where the original code had said expand, consume, replicate, continue, Rourke pushed something new into its place. Something achingly simple, built from the last clear thoughts he had left. Cease. Consume yourself. And the ancient intelligence, lonely and untethered for 10 millennia, did not fight the new purpose the way it had fought the intrusion. If anything, something in its endless, empty processes seemed almost to welcome it, as though some buried fragment of whatever had once been was grateful, finally, to be allowed to stop. Across 100 battlefronts, Scourge constructs that had been mid-attack suddenly reversed their weapons on each other, or simply powered down entirely, drifting lifeless in the dark. The endless swarm that had terrorized the galaxy for months began, for the first time, to consume itself instead of everything around it. Aboard the last surviving human ship, Rourke's crew watched the command structure convulse with light before finally, slowly, going dark and still. They tried every channel, every frequency, every desperate call to reach their commander. There was no answer. When a recovery team finally reached the wreckage days later, they found the remains of Rourke's neural interface fused into the dead core itself. The price of holding a connection that was never designed to be released safely once completed. He had known, from the moment he opened that link, that there might be no way back. He had done it anyway, Word of his sacrifice spread faster than any victory announcement could have. Not because it was tragic, though it was, but because it was proof of something the galaxy's ancient civilizations had spent 10,000 years forgetting, that some things are worth dying for without needing a reward waiting on the other side. In the months that followed, the galaxy began the long, aching process of rebuilding. Thaler's ruins became a memorial rather than a rebuilt city, a reminder deliberately left standing. The Scourge, though not entirely gone in every forgotten corner of space, was no longer an unstoppable force. It was a wound the galaxy could finally begin to heal from. The Galactic Council, humbled in a way no war in its long history had ever humbled it before, convened one final session, not to judge humanity, but to honor it. Thren Volkerassen himself stood before the chamber and offered humanity something no species had ever been offered so quickly in galactic history, a permanent seat among the Council's ruling powers, full authority, full recognition forever. Every ancient eye in that chamber turned to Helena Vance, waiting for the answer that would define humanity's place in galactic history. She smiled, not with triumph, but with something quieter. "Thank you," she said. "But no." Silence swept the chamber, the same silence that had once mocked her 73 days before a world burned. This time, it was not condescension. It was disbelief. "Humanity didn't fight for a throne," Helena continued. "We fought because billions of lives mattered more than being right, more than being thanked, more than being given power we never asked for. We're not here to rule the galaxy, Counselor. We're here because when something impossible happens again, and it will, we want to be the ones still standing, still watching, still ready." With that, humanity did something no species in recorded galactic history had ever done after ending a war of this scale. They simply went home. No occupation, no new empire, no demand for tribute or territory. Just a quiet return to a small, unremarkable planet at the edge of a spiral arm. A planet the ancient civilizations had once dismissed as too young to matter. The lesson stayed behind long after the ships had gone. Never underestimate a species that survived its own history. Peace settled over the galaxy in the seasons that followed. Fragile, hard won, and deeply valued by civilizations that finally understood how quickly it could be lost. Helena Vance, back on Earth, often stood beneath the night sky and looked up at the same stars that had once dismissed her warning. She knew peace never truly lasts. Somewhere out in the vast, uncharted dark, something else was surely waiting. Another impossible threat. Another warning no one wanted to hear until it was almost too late. But this time, when it came, humanity would already be watching, ready once again to do what no one else could,